Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another Question the Narrative video, and today's topic is, were there witnesses to the AD 70 Parousia? And we're also going to talk about, I'll say speculate on, why didn't more early Christians talk about it? Now this is technically a part of my Common Objections to Preterism series that I had started, but I have actually stopped putting that portion of it saying Common Objections to Preterism in the title simply because it just makes the titles far too long. But this is part of that, so let's get started. The video that I watched the other day that spurred on this whole series asked a question that a lot of people ask. If the Parousia, or the second coming of Christ, actually did happen, we'll say around AD 70. There are many who say AD 66 through AD 70. But if it did happen in that time period, why aren't there any historical accounts about it? And why weren't more early Christians talking about it? Well, first of all, I will say that there were historical accounts of it, but they don't teach this in schools. They don't teach this in churches even. But there indeed were. Revelation Revolution shared some of these eyewitness accounts on a blog post that they wrote. It's very long. It is very worth the read, so I will leave a link in the description box to it. And I'll just read just a few excerpts from it in just a moment. But first, I wanted to share with you something very interesting that I did share in a video that I actually made in 2021. And this is the Roman history. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it's Roman history. And this is from 1573. You can find this on Gallica. I will leave a link in the description box to this as well. But let's take a look at this, because what do we see here? That certainly looks like a soldier in the clouds. And again, it's Roman history. So as you can see, there are some Latin words on there. And I knew that some of you were going to ask what that meant. So I took the liberty to look it up on Google Translate. And Google Translate is not always accurate. So if there is anyone watching who knows Latin and can better translate this and thinks that this is wrong, just leave a comment. But according to Google Translate, what is written on this picture just means Romulus, surveying the army, suddenly took to heaven by a storm. The rapture is worshipped by his own with divine honors. So I'm going to say right away, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But what I can tell you is that Romulus was a Roman god. And you wouldn't expect the Romans in artwork to point to that and say that was Jesus. They're more likely to attribute something that's taking place in the sky, a heavenly army in the clouds. They're going to attribute it to one of their gods. So that makes sense that it would be Romulus. And I'm not even saying that picture has anything to do with what happened in the first century Parousia, but it is very interesting. And I just wanted to share that with you. Gallica has some really great pictures. You do have to know where to look, though. I have found that sometimes finding things are like finding a needle in a haystack. But once you do find it, it is well worth it. So let's just go back to Revelation Revolution. And I just want to share some of this. Jesus, the Son of Man, was literally seen in the clouds in AD 66. The following may seem unbelievable. However, all information below is taken from unbiased historical records and is easily verifiable. Sources are also listed at the bottom of the page. Preterism and the Parousia. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. In Mark 14:61-62 and John 21:22-23, Jesus declares that the high priest Caiaphas and the apostle John will live to see the second coming. In Mark 14:61-62, Jesus declares that the high priest who delivered him over to the Romans for execution will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Then in John 21:22-23, Jesus says that the apostle John will remain alive until his return. Jesus also promised to return within his generation in Matthew 16:27-28, Matthew 24, and Mark 8:38-9:1. Because of statements like these, the disciples all believed that Jesus would return within many of their lifetimes. The second coming is described in detail in Revelation 19:11-14. Here Jesus rides a white horse leading an army of angels on horseback in the clouds. An eerily similar event is recorded to have occurred in Iyar of AD 66 at the start of the worst war in Israel's history, Israel's war with Rome. On the 21st day of the month of Artemisius, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to describe such signals. For before sun setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. The first century Jewish historian Josephus describes the heavenly army in the clouds, much like the army Jesus leads in Revelation 19:11-14. This event is also recorded by other historians. The first century pagan historian Tacitus also mentions this event. In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. Pseudo-Hegesippus, I probably said that wrong, also describes the coming of Christ on the clouds with his mighty angels at that time when he writes, "A certain figure appeared of tremendous size, which many saw, just as the books of the Jews have disclosed. And before the setting of the sun, there were suddenly seen in the clouds, chariots in the clouds, and armed battle arrays, by which the cities of all Judea and its territories were invaded." The medieval Jewish historian Sefer Yosipon expounds upon this angelic army in the sky of AD 66 by saying, "Moreover, in those days were seen chariots of fire and horsemen, a great force flying across the sky near to the ground, coming against Jerusalem and all the land of Judah, all of them horses of fire and riders of fire." The parallels between these three accounts in Revelation 19 are striking. However, in Yosipon's account, one can see how 2 Thessalonians 1:7 was explicitly and literally fulfilled in AD 66. This will happen when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. So this right here does show you that many believe that it was actually 66 when Jesus made his appearance. However, a parousia is not something that has to be instantaneous or last a very short time. Many believe the parousia actually did last from AD 66 until AD 70, and it would be consistent with other uses of the word parousia, which were used for the Roman Caesars. When they would go somewhere, it would be called a parousia, and sometimes they might stay there for over a year. So to say that Jesus's second coming lasted 4 years would be consistent, at least with the word parousia being used for it. The coming of Christ in the presence of fiery angels riding horses and chariots, recorded in AD 66 and predicted in 2 Thessalonians, mirrors the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 66:15 in a surprisingly literal way. "For behold, the Lord will come in fire, and his chariots like the whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire." Descriptions of the coming of the Lord in judgment in Psalm 68:17 and Habakkuk 3:1-8 are also described in a similar fashion. Interestingly, The fiery army of angelic horsemen and charioteers of AD 66 was not the first time a specter like this was recorded in Israel. In 2 Kings 6:17, Elisha is protected by an army of angels like those who were expected to accompany Jesus during the second coming. This fiery army of angels is described exactly as the army of horsemen, horses, and chariots of fire recorded by Josephon. 2 Kings 6:17 reads, "And Elisha prayed, 'Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see.' Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha." Notice that in both cases an army of angelic horsemen appeared as horsemen and chariots of fire. So as I mentioned, this is a rather extensive article. There's so much information in here, and it's definitely worth taking a look if you just want to follow the link that I leave in the description. But let's head on to my next point. So we did answer the initial question. Were there witnesses to this first century parousia? And yes, there were. But now let's move on to the other question that usually accompanies this. Why didn't more early Christians talk about this? Why aren't there more accounts by the first century Christians who actually would have been there in Jerusalem to witness this? Well, the first idea that I have thought of, and remember, I'm speculating here because I can't tell you exactly why that's the case, but I think that there are some possibilities that are worth talking about. So the first possibility is that the first century Christians may have received their spiritual bodies and gone to be with Christ upon his return. And in another video that I recently did, I did talk about shortly after these heavenly armies were seen in the clouds in AD 66, there was an event involving Nero where they were digging a canal, and all of a sudden there was a sound of a trumpet that was heard, and there were disembodied voices coming up out of the ground. And there are many who believe that that was actually the general resurrection. And it happened just within a few weeks of the heavenly armies being seen in the clouds. So the question is, could the first century true believers have been, we could even use the word raptured here. Could they have been raptured at that moment? So the people who were deceased in the ground, they would have been resurrected. But those who were still alive at the coming of Christ, is it possible that it was then that they received their spiritual bodies? If all of the true believers were, we'll just use the word again, raptured to be with Christ at that point in time, then it would certainly make sense as to why there weren't more Christians talking about this, because they had already gone to be with the Lord. Now, I am going to say that this isn't something that I'm really sure where I stand on at this point in time. And even when it comes to covenant eschatology, which is another name for preterism, and I kind of like that name better, or fulfilled eschatology. But when it comes to covenant eschatology, not everyone agrees on what actually happened to the believers who were still alive at the coming of Christ. There are some who believe that they had a spiritual, that they received the spiritual body and gone to be with Christ like this. And then there were others who believe that they had not, and that they continued living on the earth. But I'm going to read to you from the book, The Return of Christ, Why Are We Still Waiting? By Pete and Rachel Rue. And I can just give you that point of view. Most Christians today are familiar with the concept of the rapture. It is believed to be a future event where Christians will be instantaneously removed from the earth and brought to heaven. Paul teaches about both the rapture and the resurrection in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. Both the living and the dead were to experience a change at the same time at the coming of the Lord. To put it simply, the rapture is the change of the living, and the resurrection is the change of the dead. Paul expected this event to happen during the lifetime of some of his readers. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 51 to 52 say, "We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed." So I want to point out to you that this is the verse where it says that a trumpet will sound, which is in line with the account of what happened when Nero was digging the canal. And it says the dead will be raised incorruptible. And that was when disembodied voices were heard coming up out of the grounds. And I believe that in some accounts that I have read, it even says that there were kind of phantom-like things that they saw with the disembodied voices. So 1 Thessalonians 4:16 to 17 says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, and with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds." So that sounds consistent with the dead being resurrected up out of the ground, and then it is possible that the first century believers may have then been gathered together to be with Christ, and maybe that is why we don't hear a lot of accounts from Christians, because they were not on this earth anymore. Now, I'm willing to bet that people would have converted after witnessing an event such as this. So even if the believers were taken up to heaven to be with Christ, and then people were converted after the fact because they were eyewitnesses to this event, that is certainly how Christianity would have continued to grow. But we need to remember that not everybody writes things down. It's not actually something that most people do. So we need to keep that in mind. We expect that everyone is going to meticulously keep records of everything. But they were going through a time of great upheaval, a lot of turmoil going on. And, how many of them at that point in time would have taken the time to write an account? I'm not saying that they didn't, because chances are, this is going to head right into my next point. Chances are that if there were other accounts that people did write down, especially those of believers, they may have been confiscated. I'm thinking possibly by the Roman Empire. We might even find things like that in those secret Vatican archives that no one is allowed to get into and see. And even the Smithsonian. We all know that they're pretty nefarious. They hide a lot of things. And it would not surprise me if they would cover up something like that, because of course they would not want anyone to know that Jesus Christ is real, and he came and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. And my last guess as to why we do not hear of more accounts by first century believers who would have witnessed the Parousia. I just want you all to just realize how quickly things can change, whether it is history, whether it is some other sort of narrative. Sometimes it seems like the snap of the fingers, and all of a sudden everything that you thought you knew becomes something completely different. And you even get to the point where you don't even know if what you originally believed was true to begin with. And, one example of that is the whole, what was it? Was it the Jesus movement? The Jesus Revolution. That's it. The Jesus Revolution of the 60s and 70s. I mean, look how fast that transformed what the church looks like, and really brought in dispensationalism to be the primary eschatological view that is now embraced by the evangelical church. Before that time, that really wasn't the case. Now, the Scofield Bible, that certainly helped with it as well. But the Jesus Revolution, that really changed everything. And the way that the church viewed the end times vastly changed in that time period. So is it possible that during that time there may have been, I love the word nefarious, so I'm going to say it again, There may have been nefarious people who had their reasons to want to cover up what actually happened. And unfortunately, it may have been kind of pushed onto these early believers who were still true believers in Christ, but who may have been convinced that maybe they didn't see what they thought they saw. Again, I'm telling you, don't take this as fact. Just take this as Shelley's musings, because I like to think, and when things get in my head, I just keep thinking about them all the time, and that's usually why I end up doing these videos. And that's actually why I've been talking about fulfilled eschatology for the past several videos, because yeah, I need to get it out of my system, and I need to share what I have learned. So remember, this is about question the narrative. I am not telling you for sure that this is the case. Now, the last thing that I just want to tell you is, even though it's nice to have historical records, in the end, we need to remember that the most important thing that we can do is read our Bibles. Dust them off. They're not just for writing down your family tree. Unfortunately, I have family members who have beautiful Bibles that are never cracked open. The only reason that they have them is because they were supposed to write their family tree in it. That's not all that it's there for. God has this here for us. He wants us to read it. And I think it's really important, though, that when we study the Bible, we try to study it as objectively as possible. Try to brush off any preconceived notions that we have about it, maybe notions that were ingrained on us if you were raised in a church or whatever particular denomination that you are in. Read the Bible and see what it says, but at the same time, educate yourself on how the people of that time period would have interpreted it. Because the Bible was written a long, long, long time ago, and they didn't see things the way that we in the 21st century do. So that's another issue that sometimes happens, is we read the Bible through a 21st century lens, but that's not how the people that it was actually written to would have understood it. So just try to keep that in mind when you're reading it. Remember that the Bible was not written to us, but it was written for us. And that's a really, really important distinction. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, please leave one. I will try my best to answer them. I am on vacation this week, so I probably am not going to interact very much because I will not have my phone on me, and my laptop will be at home and not with me on vacation. Anyway, if you like my work, you can check out my YouTube membership page if you'd like to support me, or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.